Tall Pine White is a member of the Nipmuc tribe of central Massachusetts, a Nipmuc language instructor, cultural educator and facilitator, event organizer, and powwow MC. He is the vice chair and spokesperson, let me see if I can say this correctly, of the Chawbunadongo Mog Nipmuc Tribal Council. Pretty close? Okay, thank you. I meant to practice with you. David Brule is a member of the board of the Nolambika Project, a writer, historian, environmental activist, and educator. His latest book is Looking for Judah, Adventures in Genealogy and Remembrance. Do we have copies? And we have copies here today. A story of self-discovery, ancestry, place, and race. Both of our presenters have key roles in the National Park Service's Battlefield Grant, which is studying the 1676 massacre at the Falls in Montague. David Brule is the project coordinator. David Tall Pine White is the Nipmuc tribe's representative on the project's advisory board. And now, please welcome David and David to tell us about 1676 and beyond, tribes, race, and untold histories.
Hopefully, David and I will be able to walk around a little bit and not use the mic. I think that certainly the feedback from people in the back, if you can't hear our voices, then we'll step back to the mic, but we'll just feel a little bit more at ease moving around. I'll start by introducing the discussion today, and I'd like to call it a discussion. It's not a lecture. I think it should be more of a conversation. So please feel free to interject, raise your hand, let us know if you have something to say, obviously, hopefully on the topic. And there will be a question and answer period later on. But for now, let me give you a quick overview of what we hope to accomplish this morning. So one of the things that is let's say, crucial to this whole discussion is the single most important event, I think, historical event that occurred in our region here, which is the King Philip's War. We don't have any Civil War battlefields here. We don't have any Revolutionary War battlefields. But we definitely have a Native American versus colonial war fields here. So, and it encompassed Deerfield, Montague, Gill, Northfield, and of course Greenfield. So I'm assuming that people are all at different places in terms of understanding what happened. So to calibrate this discussion, the first part will be an explanation of the ebb and flow of the battle. I don't want to get into the whole King Philip's War event because it's incredibly complicated, very, very detailed. Strangely enough, not too many authors have plunged into that. There are a few books out there, but we're very fortunate here to have people who have made it basically a lifelong study. I have Joe Gravlin of the Nolambika Project and Howard Clark with his encyclopedic repertoire inventory of events here. So David and I are really spokespersons. We're not academics. We are people who have a stake in this, telling this history, but in some occasions, maybe today, our lifeline is going to be someone like Joe and someone like Howard. There are other people in your area, such as Gary Sanderson, who has written about this, writes in the Greenfield paper. There's also Bud Driver, a number of people who have really been extremely involved in the Pocumtuck people who lived here, and also the King Philip's War. So the program will definitely involve a little bit of information about the battle, but mostly on our title it said 1676 and beyond, because even though that happened 349 years ago, the trauma is very real. And David David will address that, and I can anecdotally tell you about what's happened in our advisory board meetings as we are working through this battlefield grant phase 1. So it's not something that happened and was over. We have survivors, the descendants of these people, both on the colonial side and on the Native American side, who are still among us. As you may well know, people who were descended from those settlers are still here in the valley, some in Deerfield and Greenfield and Montague. So it's very real for a lot of people, even though it was 349 years ago. So we'll talk about the centerpiece, which is the battle, and the subsequent grant that we received to study that, and then we will give you some kind of personal points of view about what our own histories have been like through either involving the tribal identity or racial identity, and on down through our own personal lives. So I'll step aside and let David introduce himself, and then we will talk about the specifics of that battle. Thank you.
Greetings and good day, everybody. Thank you for taking time out of your beautiful Saturday to come and listen to us speak today. Just a few things to add to what Dave said. Definitely want to encourage an interactive discussion today. So if we're saying something and a question arises in your head, or you have a comment on something, whether it be for or against, so we definitely welcome that. I also like to say too, we may be sharing some things with you today that you may be unfamiliar with, some perspectives and ways of looking at history and today that may be uncomfortable for some of you. So I want to just say that I'm not here to put blame or guilt on anybody here for any events that happened in the past. I think the most valuable parts of these talks that I do is about the beyond part, what we still are dealing with today. Some of the aspects that we were dealing with 350 years ago are still, whether we recognize it or not, it's still happening. So we'd like to bring awareness to that too, so we can kind of move forward in this moment today as in this lifetime, and change things for the better so these things don't continue to happen. So I hope you enjoy what we have to share with you today. Dave's kind of set some foundations for us, and I'm going to kind of add in some context as we move through today. So again, please feel free to raise your hand as long as it's on topic. At the end, we will be having a session where we can ask any general questions you'd like. But during the presentation, if your questions could just be relative to the subject being discussed. So thank you.
So I guess we should start with the event that occurred. I don't want to refight the whole King Philip's War with you, but I do want us to get calibrated to pretty much be at the same starting place. So basically, as I tell it, I'm a spokesperson. I'm not a historian per se. And if people have specific information they wish to add that's pertinent, feel free. But when I talk about this, I tend to say, you all remember in 1620 what we used to see in the high school textbooks with the Pilgrims arriving in Plymouth and Massasoit greeting them and helping them survive through a winter or two. Sometimes you see versions of the tribal people, the Indians, bringing food to the starving pilgrims. Other times you see the pilgrims inviting the Indians in, and so who knows? The history, it may be even contrived. Did it even happen? There's questions to be asked, but picture this. Massasoit in 1620 receives the pilgrims. His son, Menacomet, and his other son, Wonseta, were trying within a generation to drive the English back into the ocean and get them off the continent. So that is how fast the turnaround was from 1620 to 1660 and 1670. It was a stark realization that the tribes were already under threat. The population of the English settlers had exploded from these few numbers of people in the the Massachusetts Bay Colony, Plymouth and Hartford, to about 45,000 in a very short time. And the Indians, of course, were very alarmed. The concept of land ownership, the concept of land usage, all of that was a huge cultural clash, if you want to coin a phrase. So by 1675, this whole area of New England was a powder keg. An incident set things off, and you can read about it. You can find out all of this by Googling whatever you like, King Philip's War. But my point is that very quickly the Wampanoag, of which Philip was a member, began to take on the English settlers. The English were trying to box in Philip in Rhode Island. He escaped and came up here to Nipmuc country, and where his father, Massasoit, had retired to. So the Nipmucs were intimately involved, and I can bet many of you have never heard of the Nipmucs. They are here. This has been their territory. David will attest to the fact that there are plenty of people of that tribal identity that are living in the central part, Athol, Orange, Grafton, Dudley, around the Quabbin Reservoir. That was their home turf, as was this part of Greenfield and Montague. So Philip headed up this way. He gathered allies, and before long, about a third of the settlements in New England were burned to the ground or under serious threat. However, a couple of incidents happened that set the tone, and that's kind of one of the themes we want to make, is what happened here in King Philip's War set the template for 250 years of American history rolling across this country, confrontation between the settler colonial types and the Native Americans. So by December of 1675, things were 50-50. The colonials had had a few victories and had pushed back, and the tribes had a number of successes. However, there was a terrible incident that occurred in 1675 in December. The Narragansett, who had remained out of this conflict, a tremendously powerful tribe, several thousand warriors, were not joining Philip. However, some of the refugees from Philip's band had been taken in by the Narragansetts. The Narragansetts moved to their winter fort in what was called the Great Swamp. And in the middle of a snowstorm, the colonials advanced on that fort, and after a fierce battle, they took over that fort. And there's a whole story behind that. What happened then was what we would call a massacre. The warriors who were defending that fort made best they could defending it, and then pulled out. The women and children and elderly left behind were burned alive, 400 people. And that was the second time that happened. The Pequot War, the same type of thing. As Joe will attest, and Howard, typically there were two forts. The warriors had a fort that they were defending, and the women and children were in a different place. Well, the colonials figured out that they were not going to attack the warriors, they were going to attack the civilians, basically. That happened twice. By 1675 December, the Narragansetts were drawn in, and that was a big problem for the colonials, because you had not only Philip's warriors, but now Narragansetts had joined in. However, the trauma was so great. What the Narragansetts did, and the great sachem, Narragansett sachem, was Kenoche. He led the refugees up here to our valley, to Northfield, and to what is now called Turner's Falls. We refer to it as Peskiomska, which was the tribal name for that area where the falls are. Now, he came here with his refugees for a specific purpose. That area had been a sanctuary for over 10,000 years. It was a very, very important spiritual landscape for these tribal people. And if you can picture the trauma of the world's coming down around them, where are you going to go? You're going to go where you have always been safe for the last 10,000 years. That area, people came to plant, to fish, to perform ceremony. That entire area around the falls, it's been established by the keeper of the National Registry as a 16-mile radius around those falls were significant. So Northfield was included, Montague certainly was part of it, Greenfield, Deerfield. So these tribal people came here in their desperation, hoping to renew their protein source with the fish runs and to find a respite, just to get away from the whites for a while and to try to, this was their safe place. It had been a peace area, peace zone for the last 10,000 years. So, that Karochet brought people here as refugees in December, January, February of 1675 to 76. Some sources have more than 3,000 tribal people living on the edge of starvation between the falls and Northfield. Primarily in Northfield, they would have moved down to the falls in the spring, waiting for the shad and salmon to come up. So on my map, you can see in the right-hand corner the refugee camp. So that is now what is called Riverside. And that had been a site for thousands of years and very extensive, where people of all tribes could go there. As long as you left your issues at the door, you could come in. There were no disputes. People came for ceremony, for food, for medicinal plants, for finding a spouse. This was a place to come to. So they settled. The refugees were in that refugee camp on May 19th, the morning of May 19th. The infamous Captain William Turner comes into our historical perspective. He himself had had a troubled past. He was a Baptist in a Calvinist puritanical town. He was put in jail for about 5 years, and he survived, but his health was broken. So if you can picture being in a semi-medieval jail and managing to survive already, that was quite a feat. He had some vague military training. The Massachusetts Bay people felt that the war was going so badly they could use anybody to help them out. So he was released from jail on the condition that he come out here and kill Indians. So at 63, he found himself in Northampton and Hatfield. There was a flashpoint again. Historical record will tell you what happened that week before May 19th, but some of the militia and the younger settlers had been pushed beyond the tipping point. The whites had lost a number of family members to raids, cattle, horses, buildings burned down, and so there was a flashpoint. They organized themselves. Again, I'm doing this in broad terms. There's a lot of detail. And they decided to head up to find the refugees. We think they specifically targeted the women and children, and I will mention that in a minute. But they came up to the area around the falls to strike a blow. Now, a lot of these were not military trained people. There were a few garrison soldiers, a few soldiers who had training. But otherwise, there was Captain Turner and Lieutenant Holyoke. Those were the officers. So they came up, you can see the yellow line starting at the bottom and along the Greenfield side of what we call Canada Hill, right here, this ridge, probably right up High Street, and came up, and they went over to what's now known as Factory Hollow, crossed over the Fall River, and tied the horses up, left the horses on high ground in a part of Gill, what's now Gill, or it could have been on the Factory Hollow on the Greenfield side, but in that vicinity right near the river, tied the horses. Joe maintains that they had each slug or two of rum because one of his friends has found rum barrel spigots up that way, so they were going to not go back home with barrels full of rum. So they all had they were afraid. It was raining. It was a terrible May morning, terrible in many ways. And so they then descended down onto the camp. And again, Joe and Howard can tell this in a more eloquent way than I ever could, but it was a horrific attack. The soldiers were firing into tents, killing anyone who was there. People, obviously, if you can picture the scene, people were screaming, children were dying. At one point, soldiers, instead of taking the time to load their muskets, took out knives and swords and killed whatever moved. People who could jumped into the river and were swept over the falls. Many, many people drowned. A lot of people were trying to escape whatever way they could. Some strong enough to swim across the river. I have heard the story of at least one or two Narragansetts who were able to get across the river above the falls over to where Unity Park is now in Turner's Falls and make their way back. Of course, the English eventually caught up with them and they were hanged. So you have two arrows showing where the native camps were. We estimate that in the vicinity of Unity Park, just below the Narrows, which is that pinch of land there where Barton Cove is now, there was a camp there, and there was a camp on the island in the river. And when the sounds of the battle or messengers reached them, they counterattacked. And in doing so, created a lot of panic among the soldiers and the settler soldiers. So they heard the rumor spread that Philip was on one of these islands that was coming to get them with 1,000 warriors. So they panicked and started running back to where the horses were, charging up through that brush pell-mell. And what we're hoping is that there are some archaeological evidence there. That's part of the study that we're doing that I'll talk about in a few seconds. And so going back along that red line, Turner's retreat route, people were in a panic. White Ash Swamp, you can see there. There's vestiges of White Ash Swamp right now. It's right very close to a very controversial piece of property where Walmart would like to build a building there. And out through Cherry Rum Brook, and Turner made it as far as what we now know as Greenfield Swimming Pool, where he was killed. He may have been wounded ahead of time, he may have expired in that spot, or someone caught up with him. In the meantime, in White Ash Swamp, you can picture these young settlers in terror, trying to get back to Hatfield and Deerfield. Deerfield had been abandoned. So they got into White Ash Swamp, and many of them never came out. And so, again, we're hoping to explore that area to find if we can unearth the true story of what happened to those white settlers who are trying to get away. Be that as it may, from that point where Turner was killed and all along that red route, people were peeling off and trying to get back to Hatfield. So, in broad strokes, that's basically what occurred that morning. Some say the massacre lasted an hour and a half or II. Others maintain that it could not have lasted more than 20 minutes. Regardless, as again, I quote Joe because he's a wonderful source of this, very descriptive. He maintains that it was like a light switch was thrown off. That was the end of this place of security, of retreat. And the Indians, although there were a few raids over the next couple of weeks, it was done. It was over. And people did not come back to this place any longer. And even to this day, when I talk with people, some from the Wampanoag tribe or the Narragansetts, I'm sure David would attest to this, they have a feel around those falls, and they dread having to take Route 2 past that site. There's a feeling there that is, we would like to remove that bad medicine and that vibration, that vibe that's there. We're working on it now, we're making progress. So, in a nutshell, that was the massacre. Over and done with May 19th. King Philip may or may not have been in the vicinity. We think he probably was, but as the war was going badly, he was making an effort to get back to his homeland in southern Massachusetts. And the English eventually caught up with him, and again, there's a number of stories that have come out of that, but he was caught, and true to fashion, what the English like to do was, dismember the body, so that certainly in the Native American belief, he would never find peace. His head was stuck up on a pole outside of Plymouth and stayed there for 20, 25 years as a curiosity. So that was Philip. And Philip, over the years and generations, has been glorified or vilified. It all depends. He has become a symbol of Indian resistance in the valley here. He may or may not have been the giant figure that he is portrayed as. He was a man, but he was nevertheless a very powerful figure and attempted to unite some of the tribes to resist the English encroachment. So it's a terrible story, but one that is still resonating on through our time. I guess I could turn it over to David if you have something to say, and then I'll bring you up to speed on 2014-15 and what we're doing about this. Okay? Thank you.
So how many people just hearing about this event or King Philip's War for the first time today? So, and the rest of you know, been taught about King Philip's War and know about the massacre that happened here? Yeah, okay, good. All right, so now we've heard from Dave very well about the general, what happened up here, and I'd just like to talk a little bit about, just kind of insert some of the factors that were happening before this event happened, to think about as we kind of look at the future here and further along the timeline. You had two clashes of cultures, beliefs, the introduction of religion into this part of the world, where in a sense it didn't really exist in Native culture. There were understandings of the way nature worked, and the way that energy worked, and the way that certain aspects of the land worked, and how we needed to work with the land and sustain it and tend to it as well in order for the continuation of that life and the sustenance of the people for many generations. That's how indigenous nations survived here for thousands and thousands of years. So we have a whole slew of factors that really just throw tons of confusion into when we ask the question, why did these things have to happen? You had a group of people that were religious fanatics in a sense, where they were very stuck to their beliefs in God and the devil and what should be and what shouldn't be. And when they came here and they saw some of the things that were being done by indigenous people, the way they dressed, the way they did their ceremonies, the way they kind of just ran free throughout the country with no real permanent home. They were nomadic people that moved throughout the land. They coined them as savages and heathens and all kinds of other things, based on their lack of understanding of why that was. And really, instead of trying to learn, it was just an instant judgment and it's bad and good type thing. Our people still that have the original teachings understand that we didn't have really a religion in a sense. It was just an understanding of how things worked in nature over thousands and thousands of years of observations and knowledge that has been passed on. Going back to this word here, when we got involved with this project, being an interest in language, I had to look at these words and go, well, who came up with those words and what do they mean? That Paskiamskat there, we find really, the translation would be translated as the fire that burst from the rock, meaning there was an ancient volcano here maybe hundreds of thousands of years ago, and those stories are embedded into the language, so they tell us a little bit more about the landscape and how different it was than what we see it as today. So religion, a big factor in what was going on here before this event happened. You had what were called these praying towns that the Christian missionaries set up. John Eliot was a big part of that in the early Massachusetts General Courts, where these little concentration camps were set up in a sense. They were called praying towns and disguised under healing the Indians and making them better so they don't go to hell. So they rounded up these natives into these praying towns, and consequently the first Bible in North America was printed right here in Cambridge in the Massachusetts language. That was the intention of that, was to be able to teach the gospel to the native people in their language, seeing as though they couldn't speak their language, so they had to somehow find a way to convey those new teachings to them. So a gentleman by the name of James the Printer, who happens to be one of my descendants, was actually one of the gentlemen that worked with John Eliot into the printing of this Bible. And I think, in the beginning, some of the words, and I'm sure some of you are familiar with some of the words in the Bible and Christian teachings, and they're very valuable teachings, and they really make a lot of sense. And I think in the beginning that natives saw that as similar to how they looked at life themselves. Respect for other things around you, for your neighbor, all those simple things that just seem to be the same as the way they conducted themselves. However, saying it and doing it is two different things. Unfortunately, they found that there really was no intention to help them. It was more to get them out of the way so the acquisition of land could be furthered on. And in the late 1676, they disbanded all the praying towns, closed them up, and shipped thousands of natives out to Deer Island, a small island off the coast of Boston. And does anybody ever hear of that? Yeah, okay, good. That's good, because a lot of times nobody ever has heard of that. So we have after this event, in the next 100 years, we have the magical disappearance of Indians, supposedly under disease, or they just nobody around. It's funny how the words are written in the books. It raises a lot of questions for me, because that many thousands of people don't just disappear, and we haven't found any mass graves or anything, so we're asking, where did they go? Now we know after this event a lot of people fled, but a lot of people didn't. We're told to believe sometimes that after the Kingfield War and after this event, the Indians kind of just threw their hands in the air and said, they got us, we lost. I hear that a lot, believe it or not. You lost the war, get over it, right? I hear that a lot, really. And it wasn't that at all. I mean, we have the French and Indian Wars well into the 18th century, where raids are still being conducted by Native people. And not only raids, but relationships still existed in the positive manner between Native people and some of the colonists. Now, another factor in this, too, is the manipulation of the mind with fear. And we still see that today, where we had, especially the Nipmuc people, commonly known as the Friendly Indians, had very positive relationships with some of the early settlers here. And of course, trade was a big part of that as well. The beaver pelt industry, corn was a big trading item. Wampum was a very highly desired thing by the settlers. And then there were things also that the natives liked to trade with as well. Like the cloth was very valuable because it was much easier than having to scrape a deer hide. You could just make leggings with the cloth and sew it up. It was very, very easy and convenient. So there were things, tools as well that the natives kind of liked as well. So there was an element of trade there, which also led up to kind of this event as well, because sooner or later whenever you have trade, you have competition. And then you have maybe natives kind of vying for the business of the settlers as well. I don't want anybody to think that we're saying that it was all the Europeans' fault and the Indians had no fault at all and they were just the innocent ones. I don't want to make that assumption, because we know that there was manipulation and natives being used by the colonists against each other. You know, and that's a big part of what, as tribal people, we're trying to heal today, because we still have that lack of trust between tribal nations because of the betrayal that happened. And through manipulation of the mind, I'll give you this land, or I'll give you, 100 bushel of corn if, you help me get, scout for these bad Indians. You had the good Indians and the bad Indians, and then sooner or later they were just all considered bad after the Kingsville War. They were all lumped into the bad. But you had such a confusing mess of manipulation going on. Not only that, but you had also different countries. You had the English. It wasn't just the English. You had the Dutch and the French vying for spots in northeastern North America. So you had different countries working with different tribal nations as well, manipulating each other as well. It was very difficult to even really know, just based on the one-sided history of these writings that we refer back to. It helps us get a little bit of a picture into what really happened, but I tend to think that we really never really know the whole story, because we know a lot has been hidden as well, intentionally. And I think the numbers have been changed as well. I believe there's many more people that were killed up here than 400. This was a very significant spot every year where I believe thousands of natives came. This was a treaty spot, it was a healing spot, and a fishing spot. And also an energetic spot. If you understand the connection with the rivers to native people, you know that we didn't go far from the rivers, at least in this part of the country. And the manipulation of the rivers too was a big part of cutting off the sustenance of traditional life. The damming of the rivers eventually in the 19th century and the 20th centuries really just took away from natural flows, the fish swimming up the river, for example. I mean, we have that fish ladder now over there, but to me it's still not good enough, because the whole thing was the strongest survived and the strongest fish made it up the river for a reason. Now anybody goes that just gets on the ladder. That's not natural either. So we need to think about how we interact with our environment, because it has affected all of us too. And the way we look at our surroundings, I think, was so much different from a European perspective too, rather than just possessions. We didn't own anything. Natives had a different perspective on land anyway, and ownership, that we didn't own land. You couldn't own land. It wasn't yours to own. No one man could own it. And I think a lot of manipulation was going on as far as land transactions go. And of course, the introduction of alcohol into native communities really clouded some judgment and forced people into making bad decisions and doing things that they didn't know that they were doing. That's one of the things we talk about a lot today, is that being separated from our land really cut us off from who we were, because we felt like we were one. It wasn't the people on the land. We were in a constant flow with the land. We were moving in harmony with the seasons, in harmony with certain things that the land provided at each time of the year. And that, in a way, allowed the land to regenerate itself. When you sit in one spot and you're stagnant, that's like death. When you're moving like a river, there's life there. The moving water is life. that's why our culture really kind of mirrored nature itself. And it was not stagnant or even, describable in one way or another. You had a whole different way of governance and leadership. You had what we know as tribes, right? We say Nipmuc tribe and Narragansett tribe and Wampanoag tribe, but in that time, you wouldn't have found a native person to say, I'm from the Nipmuc tribe. They just would not have said that because the words actually mean the land. They're talking about the land, not a people. And there was no difference between a Nipmuc, a Narragansett, a Mohegan, an Abenaki, in our ancestors' eyes. We were all the same family. And the confederacies for these small family clusters, which were autonomous, were huge, all the way up into Canada and down into Delaware, which we know as the Wabanaki Confederacy. Most people know it as now. But you had small groups of family clusters living across the land that were autonomous and were also sovereign in their own government. So it wasn't run in the sense that we have now, where you have a president or a certain group of people that was in charge of everybody. Each family group had its own sovereign government, and it was up to them to decide how to run their communities and how to interact with one another. And then you also had people moving from community to community. As I said, we were always moving. So someone living in Narragansett country could, years later find themselves in Abenaki country. And now what do they call themselves, right? That's why the whole perspective and seeing who you are and calling yourself who you are is totally different. And seeing yourself and what you really were is totally different. I mean, even looking at European people, we're basing this on race. This group here today, we're under the heading of race. And through our ceremonies and our way of life, all those, they're not any less important than one another. Like they're all part of that circle, like every living thing. That's why I said there's no religion, it's just everything just is. And it's respected as necessary in the world. Because it wasn't us that created it, it was something higher than us. So we're just a part of that. So we need to really change we need to kind of like turn off our academic mind sometimes when we always look to words and writing and try to ask ourselves simple questions like why, who benefited, who didn't benefit, and who continues to benefit. So I think we're going to be talking about that some more as we move through time here. But those are some of the different factors that were leading up to this event. The different laws that were made within the Massachusetts Bay Colony at the time that directly opposed the natural culture of Native people. Having to fence in your land, they made a law that if you didn't fence in your land, they could seize it at any time. You couldn't do any work on Sundays because it was the Sabbath. So if you were found working, you'd be penalized for that. And some of the double standards that were happening as well. You had cattle and things that were encroaching onto native cornfields and taking away from their sustenance. And yet, when complaints were made to the courts in Boston, they were very seldom heard. So it's a continuing double standard as we see even up into the present time with native rights and politics spreading all the way west out into California and Alaska. That is a continuation of that same concept. And it started right here. Really, this was the birth of the whole reservation system. It started out here as praying villages under the guise of Christian conversion. So, but it was the same thing, and same thing happened in these days. And don't forget the propaganda as well. Be afraid of the Indians, the savages. They'll kill you. They'll scalp you. They'll do all these bad things to you. So if you see an Indian, he's better off dead. I mean, by this time, people didn't even distinguish between one or the other. But as we move through time, we'll talk about after this event, how things still continued. And it's clear that natives were still unhappy with what was going on with land usurpation. And from what I can gather, had no even idea that they lost a war, that it wasn't ended. It was was continuing, and even still many natives today still believe that war continues on a different kind of level. So as we move through these things, try to think about there's different factors involved, and we can't just pin it down on they were just bad white people, and I don't even like using that word, because really, if we're going to start understanding each other and moving forward by learning about these things of the past, we really need to let go of those little boundaries that we give to each other, your color, your skin, or your beliefs, or whatever, the way you walk, the way you dress. I mean, that's really the core of what's behind the problem here and still here. Is that instead of, looking at ourselves, we look outside of ourselves and we try to pick all the bad things out about each other. I don't like that about you. That's wrong. That's right. I think that's a big part of where we stand today, and was a big part of this, is that European people, for the most part, had no desire to sit as equals with anybody. And that was a big part of just law for thousands of years of indigenous cultures all over the world. Is that one thing was the golden rule, that you sat as equals. Now, if everybody says that, it's easy to say, yes, you're my equal. But then when you sit at a table and you say, I don't like that, no, I have the authority to say no, that's exactly opposite of being equal, And I think that's something we're trying to incorporate when we're starting to talk with government agencies and people like that, is that they don't seem to understand that concept, that they're not in charge. Nor were they ever. It's just an illusion. So it's a slippery slope, because you have to give them the respect that they are expecting too. So it's kind of fun sometimes, but I'll let Dave come back up and we'll move further down the timeline. Is there any questions before? Yes.
I just wondered if you could speak a little bit about the oral history of tribal cultures and how that affected what we know today.
Is that okay for now, Dave? Or?
Repeat the question. If you want, because it's pertinent to the next part of the discussion, if that's all right.
Should I answer that, Dave? The question was about oral histories, and what was the second part of that? I'm sorry.
Well, why it's the cause shift in what we know today in terms of what happened because of the way that history was recorded or not recorded by tribal peoples.
Yeah, I think, when we started to get involved, everybody hear the question, Jess, about the oral histories and how that affected the recording of history and what effects that might or might not have had. As far as oral histories from a tribal perspective, and I think a lot of people in the Great Falls Project were surprised to hear this, but I almost kind of laughed, because after all the things that you're going to hear about today, to expect that in this generation that we would hold these memories after you look at all the trauma today and all the different factors that happened into the 19th and 20th centuries with the Indian child welfare policies of Massachusetts, how they would ever even be able to speak about that. There was a silence for many generations as far as our people, and a want to forget. I still have cousins today that don't even want to say anything about being Indian or even not acknowledge it. They don't even, and they don't know why. It's just their inner trauma from their past historical experiences. When we look at life from an indigenous point, it's much different than we see as we just live and die and that's it. We come back again and again until we complete our mission here, and who knows how long we've been here doing that. But there's not a lot of oral histories left within the tribes. I'm not saying there's none, especially in the East, because you have probably a 4 or 5 generation gap where there was a silence, because it wasn't healthy to talk about it. It wasn't something that was supported. Like today, me sitting in front of you here today would have been very dangerous less than 100 years ago. My father tells me stories about my grandfather and my uncle a lot, and how even in their days, it started to be popular. That was a cool thing. People were starting to say, wow, that's cool, instead of, lynching and stuff like that. But, I look back on that, and I have a lot of great gratitude that I didn't have to go through that, because there's a lot of trauma still being held on to. As far as, we get into the 19th century, the removal of the Indian children, the sterilization of women, the removal of men to the various wars of the great USA, were on the front lines. They didn't put light-skinned people on the front lines in these wars. They put the dark-skinned people there because they were expendable. So we lost a lot of people, even up into the 20th century, 18th century that way. And that, I think that in our band, the Shibunagagumog band, better known as Dudley Webster, which is just a remnant of the praying town of Shibunagagumog. There were 6 families remaining in that area. So we have a very small group within our tribal unit, because we all have to kind of descend from those 6 families. So it's not a large group like you might go on to Arizona or Lakota or whatever, where you have thousands of tribal members that exist here. It was a high level of decimation and removal. From the DR Island to the relocation north and west to the tribes up that way, and then after the child welfare program from the state of Massachusetts, with the removal of children into the newly named plantations of Massachusetts. They were no longer praying towns, they were now plantations. And a lot of these plantations now had Irish immigrants as well, a lot of Irish immigrants and African American immigrants as well, ended up there as slaves on these quote-unquote plantations. We're going to get into that more. I don't want to say too long. Let Dave get back up here. But there was one other hand up. Yes.
I just wanted to point out an important part of the history is the construct that got set up early on with the doctrine of discovery. So there was intention that there would be white male Christians taking the land with a papal decree to back it up, and that's still in the Constitution of the United States. And I say this because I often feel like what happened to women is missed in this conversation, because in Native culture, women in the land are one and the same. And when they took the land and they disempowered all other people of color and all women, and it was the objectification of the earth that sets the table for all the environmental desecration that's going on, and also all the violence against women and children. And I feel like that piece of the history was intentional. And like the massacres, I always thought it was collateral damage that they killed the women and children. But no, it was intentional. They had sayings like knit, make, lice, and like you can see, the whole thing about the language. They didn't want anyone to learn how to read, except for white people. It was a long time before they would even want any women to learn how to read, or people of color to learn how to read. And they were pretty shameless about what they put in writing, thinking they were the only ones that would see it. And so it's pretty amazing when you look at those historical accounts, just how terrible this really was, and how intentional it really was. And I feel it's still going on a global level today to other indigenous people around the world. And it's still going on with disappearing women and children in Native communities. That is a problem that's not spoken about much. So when we tell this history, I really feel a need to put the intentional killing of women and children as getting rid of the progeny, as part of their racial integrity acts that they had, that they wanted the only white people to be a pure race of people. So I don't want people to feel guilty either, but I think that the truth is what sets us free. The ownership of those kind of constructs, and like undoing that right now, which is what I assume that, we're doing now by sitting here and talking about. So I just wanted to share that.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that too. And again, that goes back to the shift, that total shift of way of life from a maternal-based way of life to a paternal, male control versus female control. And we're brought up to see the dignified Indian chief making all the rules and that's what we're taught at school, is that facade, but it's totally false. It was the consular grandmothers and the women that put the men in these positions in the first place, and took it away if they didn't conduct themselves properly. There's confusion even among Native people, Native communities about that, because that Christianization has been so indoctrinated into their lives and cultures that it's changed the way Native people, look at women and treat women and treat each other. And that's, I think, exactly what we're trying to work through with this, and that hopefully we can come from a human level rather than white, black, this, that. I mean, that's the problem, isn't it? So I'll let Dave come back, and I'll be back. Thank you.
I guess I'd like to move us forward in history. I do have a slide towards the end that I want to show you that would pick up on what Strong Oak was saying and what David was saying. But I'd like to tell you a little bit more about how things have evolved, at least concerning this atrocity. And basically, it came about 2 or 3 years ago when, well, let me go back a couple more years before that. In 2004, some of the townspeople, Nolambika Project people, and tribal people had an idea. This bad medicine overlaying the village site around Gill, Riverside, Montague, Turners Falls, let's do something about that. So there was an official ending of the war, basically, a burying of the hatchet that occurred along the riverbank. Many people here participated in that day. It was a tremendous, important moment. And the medicine man from the Narragansetts, Lloyd Running Wolf Wilcox, performed an ancient Narragansett ceremony that brought an end to the state of war. So that was a watershed moment. And as Nolambika projects evolved, and as people were drawn to finding a way to reverse all the bad energy, things started happening. Paul Robinson, who was the Rhode Island state archaeologist, very good friend of the Tribal Historic Preservation Office of the Narragansetts, myself, Joe, Howard, a number of other people, started racking our brains to figure out how to come up with something that was going to reverse that negative flow after the ceremony happened. There was again, events started speeding up. There was a controversy at the Turners Falls Airport, and what occurred was that there was a ceremonial hill that the tribes didn't want to share information about because there's a fear of looters. It came down to a standoff between the airport, who wanted to bulldoze this ceremonial hill and use it for fill under an extension of the runway, and the tribes who said, this is significant for us. This is a very important ceremonial place for prayer and for observation of the heavens. And so, fascinating story. It's been written about and before in the newspapers, but I'm trying to keep it short. So the upshot was that the tribe said, okay, we're going to appeal this to the advisory board of Section 106, which means that Section 106 basically states that if there's any federal money involved in projects, that the tribes have to be consultants. And when there's a difference of opinion, you go to the advisory board and there's a decision made. And it turned out, lo and behold, that the advisory board agreed with the Indians that indeed that was a ceremonial hill, that was an important place, and it was the very first ruling that happened this side of the Mississippi River in favor of the tribes and their sacred sites. Not only did he do that, did the keeper of the Registry of Historic Places do that, but he also declared, as I mentioned earlier, that from that point there was a 16-mile radius of a significant spiritual landscape, and all of that should be considered eligible for the registry, which is huge in terms of preservation of land, the pipeline that wants to go right through the middle of that. There's all kinds of important aspects of that. So that was the next big thing that happened. And then I mentioned Paul Robinson and Doug and Joe and myself and Howard and a number of other people trying to find a way to bring some energy to this healing. And we came upon the idea of this massacre site, about which some has been studied. There's been a few archaeological digs, and there's documentation that you can find, but for people like us, it's pretty hard to locate, hard to get a story that you could grasp and think about. So we applied for a American Battlefield Protection project, and the first year was very, very funny. Not so funny because we didn't get it. We applied, and one tribe signed on, Narragansetts, and the other tribes didn't know much about it, and so it wasn't handled very well. The National Park Service said, well, no, we won't give you any money. We want more Massachusetts tribes. So that, me being a retired school teacher, I had a lot of time on my hands after this intense career in the Amherst Public Schools. So I set about writing every single tribe I could think of in Massachusetts. And so the plan was to get Massachusetts tribes, because there was a thing between the state archaeologists of Massachusetts and the Narragansett tribe of Rhode Island, and that's a whole other story. It's where the volumes and could be written about this type of thing that goes on. However, we lined up David's tribe. The Nipmucks sent us a letter of recommendation, a letter of support for the grant. The Aquinnah Wampanoag of Martha's Vineyard were right at the beginning, were totally involved. The Narragansetts brought the Mohegans, and I pestered the Stockbridge-Munsee Mohegans with a C until finally they coughed up a letter. And so by then we had the Mashpee Wampanoags, the Aquinnah Wampanoags, the Narragansetts, the Mohegans, and the Nipmucks. And then I thought, okay, the state archaeologist is the titular head of the Massachusetts Historical Commissions. I'm a historical commissioner in my town, and we have historical commissions in Montague, Greenfield, Deerfield, Gill, Northfield. So we all sent these really strongly worded supportive letters to our head saying, we want this battlefield plan because we really think we need to document this and protect it. And the person in charge of the Massachusetts Historical Commissioners, after having told us in public meetings, oh, well, you are our lifeline, I said, well, okay, we're going to make you pay for that. So we asked the National Park Service, who oversees the Massachusetts Historic Commission. We got their grant. We asked for $60,000, and we got it without any cutting back. And I think a lot of it had to do with the fact that people like David's group, David himself, and the tribal people, and so imagine that, Greenfield and Montague agreeing on something, which is pretty rare if you're from around here, and of course Deerfield has their whole historical background, which, by the way, the famous raid on Deerfield, we all think was directly related to this, 1676, And the raid happened in 1704. Well, guess who participated in that? Some very angry Indians who some of whom had left and gone up to Canada and to the French missions, and who had talked over this and worked on their revenge and had gotten some military support from the French, and they came swooping down on February 29th in 1704 and really exacted payment for, I think, what happened here. There were other motivations, plenty of other motivations, but there were definitely some Pocumtuck descendants who had a score to settle with Deerfield and with this part of the valley. So in 2014, we received the grant, and right away, we felt that the town of Montague, basically, we had to have a town government supporting that grant, and so it was Montague, which is great. And it was a battle, because there was a selectman on the Montague board who, anything that involved Indians, believe it or not, this was 2 years ago, anything involved Indians, he was against it. Voted down again and again. Joe was ready with the Massachusetts general law saying, if you have a town official who is using his position to exact revenge or retaliation on any group, then he could wind up being in deep trouble with the state. So people held Joe back, and we managed to get this through finally, but consistently of a 3-board member, it was 2-1. 2 in favor, 1 against, and I thought the man was skating on thin ice, because at any time we could invoke this Massachusetts general law. And so it turned out that we had to fight tooth and nail, just because people said, well, why should Montague be supporting this when it happened in Gill and Riverside? And so we needed to make the point, that in 1776 there was no such thing as Gill Riverside. This whole place was sacred, and it was the site of an atrocity. So, long story, but it wound up getting much shorter. We got the grant. We formed an advisory board of all these tribes who had signed on, and the towns, and a couple of extra historians, the archaeologists. We hired after going out to bid, we hired a team from the Mashantucket Pequot Museum, none of whom are Indians, but they work for the Pequot tribe, but they are also world-class archaeologists and military terrain analysts. So they have been working for the last year and a half collecting data, which, by the way, if you want to see that, it is now public information. It's about 200 pages of state-of-the-art information with maps and all that about that particular massacre and the general context of King Philip's War. It should be in your libraries Monday. It came out in public meeting on Wednesday, and the town of Montague promised to make copies for each of the towns available. And it's available on the Montague website. So, it's really a fascinating article, a study. And it is in, what would I call it? It's in the editing process right now, so the comment period is wide open. And so if you wish, or if you know, I know that our people have a lot of rectifications that we are turning in. The team will have a lot of revising to do, but it's available, and the window is open from now until December to make comments. And all that information is available on the Montague Town Hall website, or your historical commissioner in your whatever town you're in, if you're from the 5 towns. Otherwise, you'd have to go online, but it's available. So the spin-off has been pretty impressive. However, one thing that I needed to mention, and it refers back to Beth's question and David's answer, is that the real hook for almost all of us who has ever heard of this grant and who participated in this grant, and I think it really grabbed the National Park Service, who was already struggling with the fact that they hadn't had any King Philip's War battles in their battlefield protection before. So it was new ground for them. They had supported one battle site between the Narragansetts and the Mohicans at the beginning, a part of King Philip's War, but this was the big deal. So when our town manager went down to Washington, D.C., they were basically winging it because they were just going to place a lot of faith in what we could do. And we're setting the template once again, which is a pretty good feeling. So the element that was really the most important in all of our eyes was that not only would we have what we call the Yankee version, David mentioned this, history in black and white. You know, the perpetrators of this massacre either wrote things down or told people the stories and they wrote it down. And some of these people, such as Pynchon of Springfield and others who were very important at the time, wrote letters back and forth, and all of that is in Massachusetts archives. However, the tribal people were not writing this down, and they were not communicating, via the written word. So what we wanted to do was to have each of the participating tribes tell their own story. Nobody was going to edit it, synthesize it, blend it. It was going to be, each tribe was going to make a statement. And so that really grabbed the attention of the Park Service. They agreed that that would be what we were going to do. So, so now we have the Yankee version, and then the issue came up of oral histories. Now, this is an event that happened 350 years ago. It was traumatic, and that would put, for example, our 7th great-grandparents would be the ones who would have experienced that, 10 generations ago. So where are you going to find that? If you go to something that happened at Wounded Knee in the 1890s, there are people, there were even reporters that were available. But this happened, here in isolation in 1676. So it's going to be pretty challenging. And that's where we're at right now. We had a very, very interesting meeting on Wednesday, and you're all invited. It's a public meeting. You can attest to that. On every first Wednesday, we meet as an advisory board, and the public participates fully. It's a very dynamic process. And we were reviewing the research team's work, but we were also commenting on the tribal narratives that were coming in. And that is proving to be a very challenging effort on the part of the tribes, because it is so painful, because they were removed from the landscape in a lot of ways, emotionally. And in 1676, do you keep telling the story of this horrific massacre? Because I know I'll show you in a few minutes, this was only the beginning. Only the beginning. So we had one member of the board from a historic commission who said, I want to see something in writing. I want to see what happened. And, David and Doug Harris and the Stockbridge Muncie representative were saying, it's really hard to put that down. It's really hard to know. And Doug Harris of the Narragansetts is very eloquent, as he always is. He's saying, I'm consulting my ancestors, I'm consulting, the spirits are not letting me tell the whole story. So you talk about a difference between perspective on yourself, on your tribe, on your land, on an event. It's not Anglo-American storytelling or writing things down. This is something that is profoundly traumatic. And David hinted at that. He said, people are carrying this trauma around. They don't know where it comes from, but there's some anger there. They don't know why they're angry. And this is where this whole non-white issue comes in. I mean, it's the same for our brethren, the African American people. It's the same for the tribal people. It's so traumatic, and some stories were carried on, some stories were embellished, some stories were lost, but it's very, very hard for the tribes. It's proving right now very hard for the tribes to put down what happened. So I kind of brought you up to date. I'd like to have David comment on that, but what I'm saying is that what we will see, and you can read it yourself, it's on the website, it's going to be in your town library, the Narragansett version, the Narragansett narrative, and the Wampanoag is coming in. It's not completed yet, but what we had at David's suggestion, and he was about to complete the Nipmuc narrative, but there was one more step, which was to consult with the elders, to talk with them, and he wanted them to walk that place, Wissahickon and the refugee camp, for themselves. So Joe and I met them 10, 12 days ago, and it was very, very emotional, if you can only imagine. Very wonderful people. The chief of the Nipmuc band that David belongs to, and two elders, and we visited Riverside and walked around Riverside, and they had not been there. The chief had been before, but the other two women who were in their late 70s were walking that for the first time, and they could feel things, and what they wanted was to bring their children and their grandchildren there to see. David will attest to this, being removed from the landscape. I mean, how can you continue to tell a story and relate if you have not walked that area for 5 generations, have not dared to? We were asked to do this talk on climate change, David and I, at Harvard, no less, last spring, and he mentioned, which is something I didn't know, on the books in Massachusetts, you could not, as an Indian, be in the streets in Boston without being legitimately shot, and that just was removed from the books, unless it's still on the books, I don't know, but those were the types of things that were going on. So how to have an oral history of that? Certainly, Sitting Bull's descendants would have an oral history because it was only a couple of generations back, but this would have to be 10 generations. It would be very hard to come up with some oral history. But they're working on it, and basically what I'm talking for David, but he'll tell you. The issue is, where do we go from here? Will we sit? We are sitting at the table as equals. We're telling our story. And I like to say, as a former teacher, there's tension around there. And where there's tension, that's where the learning takes place. You're at the edge. It's not, all fuzzy and comfortable. This can be challenging because there's strong feelings from the white side still. And the tribal people have to tell their story the way they tell it. They will not translate it into Anglo-Saxon Yankee terms in black and white. They will tell it, and that's what they're telling now in these stories that you'll be able to read. But it's really the aftermath that is really important. And so anyway, I'll step back a little bit, and David, if you want to just take that a little ways, and then we'll bring up one more aspect, and then I want to show you a couple of things, and we'll have some questions and answers, okay?
So David told you a little bit about this project that has really generated this whole new doorway into the future between several communities. And I think in the beginning it was hard. I think it's hard for a lot of Native people to actually admit that they don't know something. people expect us to just like retain everything since day one, you know, like, oh, do you remember the Turnus, one of the guys at the meeting said, well, I was expecting to see like a story from your great grandfather about what time of the day it happened, and how many people were there, and who killed who. And, like, he really believed that that information still existed after something like that happened. And it's good to get that out and talk about it, because that's where we see the lack of understanding there. So we talk about the things that lead up to, you know, the lack of this oral history and the things missing. You know, how many times I get approached and say, oh yeah, what's this mean? I saw this eagle today, what does that mean? And this bear was in my yard today, tell me what that means. What is in store for me, and all this stuff. It's interesting and funny, but you know, there are some of those foundational stuff that we will never lose. As far as respect for our surroundings and each other, and for our women and our children, which are the most valuable things that we can have, which they knew, which is exactly why that's the first resource they went after. If you can cut off a whole lifeline and break the chain of a whole culture, how do you do it? Well, you take out the life givers, and you take out the youngest, and then you make the slaves and soldiers out of the men. And then they forget. And then they'll want to forget, you know. So that's, I mean, it makes sense looking at it from an objective point of view, like, yeah, that makes sense, why they did that. But, you know, it's a very intentional campaign against humanity, in my opinion. And I think every race, no matter where you're from here, no matter what country you're from, you've had that trauma too, probably, or been involved in it in some way, or been affected by it, you know. It's, when I started to, after I learned about the history of this area, I started to ask a lot of questions, and things didn't make sense as to why. So I started to look into the rest of the world and the conflicts that happened over there, and they all seem to have a common thread each and every time, and then I see it today too. It's still happening. Where we are engendered with fear and propaganda and disinformation in order to, you know, further the goals of some other group who's bettering themselves financially and putting another mass group of people into a bad situation and having them manipulate into fighting one another. I mean, that's the story time after time after time. So getting back to the oral history part of it, sorry I kind of waved off there, but you know, I think that's tough for a lot of Native people to come to terms with, is that to say I don't know. And I think that it is too hard to talk about and too hard to say. There's a lot of guilt there, I think, too, that, you know, I forgot, or my family forgot, or, you know, there's a lot of, that's part of the healing process that we're going through, is to kind of try to let that go and understand that we still have what's important, you know. We may not have all the ancient ceremonies, but they're coming back, and the land is showing us the ceremonies by coming back to the land. It's giving us some information and a way to heal. And I think this place here, there's something about it, but not just for Native people, but for anybody around it. There's something about it that brings a healing and a cleansing. So I'm grateful to have been asked to be part of this. You know, as far as Nipmucs go, we haven't really been asked to be a part of a lot of things. I mean, because we're not federally recognized, we're considered not real Indians. That's the first question people ask. However, they don't even know what federal recognition is or what it means, or they just assume that if you're federally recognized, you're a real Indian, and if you're not, then you're not a real Indian, than you used to be. I mean, that's really how people see things. And just so you all know, federal recognition has nothing to do with your blood quantum or whether you tie into a native tribe or not. It has to do with just being eligible for federal funds. That's all it is. It's basically the gist of why tribes been tricked into this process, and I do believe it's a trick by the BIA, to sell the rest of what remaining rights they haven't already signed away. Unfortunately, with the glim and glamour of the casino age and the material world, and you take a people that have had nothing for generations, barely put food on their table, and you wave a $100 bill in front of their face and guarantee that the rest of their life will be easy. Just sign here. That's what's happening. The continued manipulation of tribes through the federal recognition process. And I can tell you, we were in that process for 30 years, and I can't tell you, I was young, just kind of observing at that time. My father and uncle were part of the tribal councils, but I wasn't really involved directly. But some of the stories they told me, and some of the experiences that some of the other elders told me from the process, we had threats from Senator Kennedy's office, telling us to drop the Deer Island protest, and we'd get our federal recognition. Just shut up about the Deer Island thing. We've had phone calls from Senator Kennedy's office. We've had manipulation from BIA agents, and a personal sexual nature, manipulating some of the leaders of our tribe into splitting up. We started out the process as one unified group, and then we broke into two because there was a power struggle and a intentional integration by BIA agents to break up the tribe. And I think that happens a lot if you look at the tribes around the country. That's what happens to them. You have a group of people that know nothing about who they are. They're Indian, but they want some kind of fame or fortune. And then you have the traditionals that have always been the leaders of the tribe and don't want any of that. And it creates tension. And then the government comes in and tries to give more power to the ones that don't really know what they're doing. And then you get the people fighting against one another, and here we are. So thank God we're not trying to recognize. We have had an opportunity to really, and I say that with all honesty, is that we've had the opportunity to come back and heal and really talk about bringing our community back together again and not be thrown into the nightmare of the federal processes that don't follow their own laws anyway. So why would we, and that's what I asked my elders, why do we want to be recognized by someone who is unlawful? Doesn't that make us unlawful? So we need to think about these things, not only as tribal people, but as communities working with indigenous nations and understanding how their towns were formed. Many of the towns in Massachusetts were formed by grants from the state for killing Indians, for clearing the land of Indians. These are how the towns were first formed. You can go back and see their own recording, where the state gave so many dollars per scalp, and for clearing X amount of acres of land of any remaining Indians. This is in the 18th century, well after the King Philip War. And these towns were granted to these people. So, these towns were founded on murder and Indian killers. So that's the kind of whatever area you may be in may be holding. And maybe it's up to all of us to kind of let that go and kind of hopefully sit as equals at some point, where, we let go of your illusionary control over a certain piece of land, and then we all kind of sit together and talk about what's best for everybody. Now it gets back to the equality thing and how we move all together, not only here, all over the world, to look at each other differently, truly as equals. And that's the oral histories that we keep, that our ancestors give to us to give back to you. After all that's been done, there's no more room for hate or guilt or revenge or any of that. It's time to kind of move forward and let go of our egos and all that other stuff, so we can. There's going to be a time that we may have to rely on one another very soon. We're not going to be looking at color. We're going to be looking at who's there for us. So, yes, it was a question. Yeah.
I want to point out sometimes how the process subliminally works. When the first Adequate grants applied for, part in the interior said, well, you gotta bring in more Massachusetts Indians. What the hell's a Massachusetts? and then our Massachusetts Historic Commissioner, Ms. Simon, calls up Rhode Island's Paul Robinson and says, can't you keep your Indians out of Massachusetts? so the process goes on and on, very, very subtly, but just as powerfully in a way that it tries to control and prevent the coming together of people with an understanding on a broader. Turner's Falls, Gill, these are just names that have been added to a land that's existed for tens of thousands of years by people who have traveled from as far away as the Ohio Valley. What happens when you say, we need more Massachusetts Indians involved in this before we can get behind it, is another way of saying, we want to control this. We want to control this conversation. Maybe there are Indians from Quebec that have as big a conversation in this, but they would not have been, it would not have filled the requirement to get to $60,000. So David knows that Indians were walkers, that they were able to communicate with each other over long distances by physical contact. And I'd like to know what your sense is of that from your stories and your experience.
That's a great point, Joe. Like, what is a Massachusetts Indian, right? Where's the line from the Massachusetts and the non-Massachusetts? Like, where's that line? Do I use your line that you imaginarily drew there, or is there somebody 5 feet away he's out of it now? But, I mean, and then we look at what was Massachusetts back in those times. It included much of Maine. Massachusetts Bay went all the way up into Maine. So, using those, delineators to describe a certain geographic area are hard, especially when we're using recent state imaginary lines. We take away from the scope and the magnitude of tribal governments in this part of the continent, which were huge. We're talking about Quebec, the Wabanaki Confederacy, all the way up there, and even out into eastern Lakota country, were parts of this network that were working with one another. And if we look at the natural, we always go back to the natural, look at the land and I'll tell you has relationships with one another, right? So we look at the Great Connecticut River, wouldn't you figure there would have to be a relationship between the communities living at the top of the river and the bottom? Because if the ones at the top of the river took too much, then what's left for the ones at the bottom? There had to have been those relationships existing and the acknowledgement of one another, and to only take what you need, and that there are other people besides you down the river. There are hunting grounds, all that stuff. All those things have to be considered. So, yeah, what's Massachusetts Indian? I think that's a great point, Joe. And coming from a culture that doesn't understand those things, I think that's a great part of why we're here, to help them hear that. And I hope that we'll be giving them a little bit different way to think from that, Joe. But thank you. We have more time for more, Dave? You want to come back up?
Let's do some questions.
Hold on to your questions, okay?
A couple more minutes, so we'll wrap up this presentation and then we'll stay as long as you want.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you've been looking at the map for long enough.
Yeah.
I have a couple of archival photos from Ed Gregory and Peter Miller. We'll just show you the falls. Back there in the background is you can see the slight rise there. That would be Fort Hill, where a lot of the tribes had camped out and where some of the archaeology is going to be going on. And interestingly enough, that area, the little rise there, all those buildings are gone, of course, modern times. And there's a big bridge right there. But this is an 1880s shot, approximately. But that rise would have been a place where a lot of the tribes had camped, dwelled over 10,000 years. Some people have done some archaeology there, and literally the levels go down 8,000 years. And so that is still relatively untouched. Around the perimeter there are houses, but the rise in the back is still wooded. So that's going to be a very interesting place to explore. Basically, I want to bring this up while it's in my mind. The next phase, we are applying for the next phase of granting, which will really involve archaeology. This was data gathering. And if you happen to know anyone who lives in the vicinity of Nash's Mills or the French King Highway that leads near White Ash Swamp, we're looking for landowners to sign a permission slip that will allow metal detectors on their land. And that's really crucial. We've got to have people from Greenfields. We've got a huge number from Gill now who said, yes, I don't mind if it comes to that, if people can come onto my land with metal detectors looking for, because it's a battlefield grant, they're not looking for arrowheads, they're looking for bullets, musket balls, brass remnants of rifles. That's all they're looking for. And so if you think of a neighbor or an acquaintance who has land in that area, we'd really appreciate it. We need about a dozen people to just say, yes, I don't have a problem with that. Okay, and this rock formation, I believe, Joe, was what was to the far left, was what was left of the Great Rock. It's now submerged behind the dam, and also it's used for the foundation, the abutment of the bridge. Okay, the next picture. Yeah.
Just related to your, this picture reminds me that at the meeting on Wednesday, I found it very interesting that the configuration of the river itself has changed
Yeah.
dramatically
Yeah.
since
Right.
that period.
Yeah, that's if you can. The map was up there so long, so it's probably burned into your mind. But the one of the historians, Peter Thomas, had done some research into earlier mapping of the Connecticut River, and the channel had changed according to him, and so that may have created a different campsite in addition to what we know of now. So all of this information is just coming to the surface, and we're really going to have the definitive study of what happened here, because this basically was the end of King Philip's War. The morale was shattered. People left or went under the radar for generations. So one more picture, and then, yeah, this is from below the falls looking back. So that Pine Island there would have been probably the rock that we called Peskionska. Joe has uncovered information that in that channel to the left, that might well have been a flume at the time where salmon could have and shad could have gotten up the river, and which was also either an escape route for tribal people jumping in the water or a death trap. But there was apparently a straight shot right between the shore and the rocks there, where people fleeing from the point would have been swept down there. They said that there were numerous bodies collected at the foot of the falls the next weeks or so. Yeah.
Well, after that, the land was just exploded. I mean, if you think of the differences of the tribal peoples inhabitant and their relationship with the river and the edges of the lands where they lived, and then afterwards, you know, there were explosions and the land was taken.
Mm-hmm.
And,
Yeah.
you know,
Transformations. Right.
and the dam built and desecration of the way it
Yeah.
was.
And when the bridges and dams were being built, needless to say, they unearthed all kinds of remains, human remains, and artifacts. So that for oral history, I mean, I heard that from my father and my grandfather in Turner's Falls when I was growing up about various graves that were found near the abutments when they were doing that. So you're right on with that. So a personal anecdote, while we were talking about recognition, it's sort of amusing, but not so amusing. When I was exploring my genealogy, and we had a lot of, thank God for the internet and Google searches and all that, I turned up something that had been suppressed in my family for, since about the 1920s, which was that a significant part of my family were considered colored. And so I wanted to know what that meant, because just like David was saying, I thought that was very cool. And so I asked my mother about it one generation back, and she literally freaked out. I don't want to know about those people. I have no idea. I didn't know them, on and on. And so with the help of a really astute cousin of mine who was a really expert at doing genealogical trackings, we found a line from Deerfield all the way back to the Narragansett Reservation. And interestingly enough, in Deerfield, I had a group of my great-grandmother's family buried at Laurel Hill Cemetery, and which I was never allowed to know about. And so that was the beginning of a tremendous exploration, tracing these roots farther back. But like some of you, I mean, I've always been attracted to Deerfield, and Deerfield's a great place. I work there now. And my whole life been going up and down Route 5 and 10. And I had family just buried 100 yards off that road, and it was absolutely astounding. And when we found the graves, you have all these Yankee, German, and French names, and then over here near the gully was my family, and they were considered people of color, which I was, again, very proud of that. But they were clearly buried in the poorest place. There were my great-great-grandmother and a great-aunt and her children, all of whom were considered black families in Greenfield. These were people who were called Barnes and Scott and Sharp. And they were people who had been in World War I in a segregated unit, and they were buried there without any flags. So I'm not super patriotic, but I thought, damn it, they should have theirs as well. And their father had fought in the Civil War. And he was a white man, and he was buried there, and he didn't have a flag, but he was buried with the colored folks. So just amazing, these stories that were part of it. So we traced, I don't want to dwell on it, but it's important for me and hopefully to understand how it resonates. We traced it all the way back to the Narragansett Reservation, and tribal politics kicked in. First of all, I had the name of the person. He built a house on the reservation that is still standing, and it is a part of the National Register of Historic Places. When I asked the tribal people about it, don't know. Of course, they saw my face. Never heard of that. Don't know that family. I'll ask the Wampanoags. And, of course, it went nowhere, but I knew. And so I've gone back to that house many, many times. But what happens in southern New England historically was that, talking about real Indians, well, the reservations tended to be places where free black people also gravitated. And in southern New England is a very widespread tri-racial mix. There are white people who gravitated to the Indian reservations and free blacks, and everybody intermarried. And being a matriarchal society, the woman was in charge of the family. The name stayed with the woman, and if the woman got sick of the man who was with her at the time, he hit the road, and she found another man. So I literally had an ancestor who had 5 or 6 children of different colors. I mean, there were a couple of white kids, a couple of black kids, a couple of Indian kids, and they were all in the same family, brothers and sisters. And so when I was trying to find out this down in the Narragansett Reservation, I got nowhere. But what was interesting is that over time, the tribal strife was such in the 1800s that this particular branch left the reservation and went to another reservation called the Niantics, of which we had connections also. And when it gets sort of amusing is that around 1880, when all the states were detribalizing their people illegally, because they could, states cannot do that, the federal government, but not the states, they looked at this reservation where my family had been for about 3-4 generations, legitimately, and there were about 5 people left on Black Point in East Lyme, and they said, well, there's no more Indians here, so let's declare this tribe extinct. And so, because they couldn't make a living on this reservation, people like my great-grandfather came to Deerfield, came up the Connecticut River, Greenfield, Deerfield. And so there was an anthropologist who was doing a study on the Niantic-Narragansett connection, and he said it was really too bad. And I saw the article, it's really too bad that, the tribe is now extinct. And I wrote him back saying, well, last time I checked, I'm still here. I mean, I'm not extinct. So, and he was, as I wrote in my book, it was like he was talking to a living fossil or something. He had no idea that there were still, valid, legit descendants of that tribe in the area. But obviously, they were no longer on the reservation, and they had to get off the reservation to go to work in Hartford or work in Springfield. And so my story is that as this family moved up, they settled in Deerfield, and I went to Deerfield, found the records, and there was a whole extended family there of people of color. And they were considered, my great-grandfather was a person of color, a free person of color. He was a mulatto. And finally, somebody turned him white in the 1880 census. So his siblings remained black and Indian. And my great-grandfather, being light-skinned, he moved over to Miller's Falls to work at the Miller's Falls Tool Company, and he married a Scots woman, and progressively people came out lighter and lighter skinned. But that doesn't change anything, and I would have liked to know that, and we were not allowed to know it. And to the extent that other people knew in the village of Miller's Falls, and one thing that was fairly amusing is my cousin and I were like saying, "Do you believe it? I can't get over this that nobody told us." And great-grandfather was so, and I'm living in his house now. And so my cousin told this to a friend of his that he goes fishing with from Miller's Falls, and he said, "Did you know that there were people of color in our family?" And he said, "Oh yeah, we knew that. The whole town knew, but nobody told us." So it's kind of the contrary of what a New England gossip village is like. Well, they all knew, but we weren't included on it. So it's just unbelievable. And so the sequel of the story was that I discovered that my great-grandfather's siblings had children. They were all living here in Greenfield. So at one point, a number of years ago, there was a racial incident in town, and some people here who worked with Mamadou Sarr know. And he moved into Greenfield. He was a person worked on the same corridor as I did at Amherst High School. And he moved to Greenfield over near the Robbins Church. And within a couple of days that he was there, someone had written racial slurs on his driveway in chalk. So there was this is Greenfield, 2008. And so he had been through this before, and there was no way he was going to let this go by. And he's a very, very spunky guy. And so he went to the police. The police, futzed around and sort of found out that maybe it was kids and stuff like that. But to their credit, the Cultural Council in Greenfield decided to elevate the John Putnam Fiddle Festival, which happens in Energy Park in September, and I happen to play fiddle. So I went, and the extended families, people related to the Putnam family, all turned up, and they turned out to be some of the black families who have been here since before the Civil War in Greenfield. There was quite a group here, and my great-grandfather had been part of that community until he turned white and went to to Miller's Falls. So I went, and my cousin was there, and we were all armed with our genealogies, and we started explaining things to people. Of course, the families of color had, just like the white side, had, forgotten all about it or suppressed it all. And so, but it was very moving because the Putnam ceremony involved placing a gravestone over John Putnam's grave with his wife, and he had been instrumental in the Underground Railroad here in Greenfield, right on Wells Street. In his house on Wells Street, there was the people I spoke to that day remembered having seen his cellar and places where people who were escaping to the north could stay. So we had a tremendous conversation, and as one of the speakers over the grave finished, I was new to this, and I walked up to him and I said, I think our family tree is crossed, and very, very moving. And he looked at me and said, well, welcome to the family, which I found was just tremendous. It was such a validation for me, and it wasn't challenging, well, you don't look, so whatever. But those are the types of stories that still happen. And I mentioned this a while back. One of my great-grandfather's sons, my granduncle, whom I knew very well, out of high school, Turners Falls, got a position with the Boston Red Sox as a pitcher. He was an unbelievable pitcher. And in 1912, he played in Fenway Park. The year the park opened, Fenway Park did open, he was a relief pitcher and was on the roster, and I swear by March of the following year he was history, because someone had written from Greenfield to the management of the Red Sox saying he has no right to be on your team because he has black blood. And that was the end of his professional career. And he never told me that, but when the Red Sox were doing research on the 1912 team, they came around in 2012 to interview descendants of all the ball players. It's a wonderful book, by the way. It's called Opening Fenway Park in Style, the 1912 Red Sox. And they came and interviewed me, and I purposely brought over some of my cousins from the families of color in Greenfield, and so we sat in the parlor with this Red Sox guy. And he did a really good job. He did a really good job of writing it up. But when he first talked to me on the phone, and knowing what I knew by then, I said, why did Uncle Doug leave the Red Sox? And he says, well, I don't think you want to know. And I said, I think I know, but I'd like to hear you tell me. And so he did. And so they had found the research and the notes and the messages and all of that went on. So unbelievable. But anyway, those are some personal stories. I want to have you put on that list. And this list I prepared in getting ready for this, and we did title it 1676 and Beyond, and I'm not sure that people really have grasped what this could be. This is a list of some of the massacres that happened after Turners Falls, and I've got 2 pages of this. And if you want, I made copies for people. It'd be great if you were interested, you could take it and Google it, find out what this went on. But can we scroll down a little bit? So you can see the Tuscarora, Chickasaw, Battle of Fallen Timbers we all read about, Mad Anthony Wayne and William Henry Harrison, okay? How they were portrayed as heroes. These were places where, as Strong Oak said, women and children, non-combatants, were targeted because they were the future. And so they were doomed to be eliminated, okay? And of course, we all know I've heard about the Trail of Tears, but look at this, 1838. Now, I guarantee, because I've done this, if you were to look at your American history and see the line of presidents, all of those presidents, including Abraham Lincoln, supported, recommended, even insisted on this genocidal march across the country. And these represent hundreds, if not thousands, of people who were killed. Now look at the dates where Yakima, Navajo Revolt, the Santee execution of Chief Little Crow and 37 others in 1862. Kit Carson, everyone remembers comic books of Kit Carson. He was an Indian killer. Davy Crockett, Daniel Boone, they made their reputations by killing Indians. We said Indian fighter, but you know what that meant. So Custer massacred a number of people. He got his just desserts later, as we know. So there's another page. The slaughter of the buffalo. Everyone says, oh yeah, well people went out and shot buffalo. It was a policy to destroy the food source of those Plains Indians. And they managed to do it. These were the buffalo tribes. They counted on buffalo for everything. They were systematically eliminated. Little Bighorn, Geronimo's War. Now Geronimo, we all heard about, and I was appalled to hear that the attack, the taking out of Osama bin Laden was called Operation Geronimo. Now where did they get off using this great warrior as a name for this operation, which I'm not passing judgment on what happened. I'm just saying that very typical American military thing is to use Indian names. Kiowa helicopters, Comanche attack ships, all of these things are so ingrained in the U.S. military because they all cut their teeth during the Civil War and certainly after the Civil War on this type of elimination of tribal people. So the Wounded Knee Massacre, a literal massacre of people using Gatling guns to mow down whoever's in front of them. At some point, the U.S. seizes 900,000 acres in Alaska of native tribal lands in the Northwest for military bases, military reasons, but people were living there, gone. Indian termination, 1953, the feds decided no more Indians, everybody's gone. JFK, to his credit, reversed that. Then you see things starting to happen right about here. The American Indian Movement, 68, took over the Mayflower II in 70. Then Russell Means and his people, so there was finding a way to fight back. Winona Duke running for vice president, etc. So I have copies of this if you want to have a look at that type of thing, and but people don't know this. This is what I meant by untold stories. The stories are there, but nobody talks about it. Nobody realizes, and that there was a rolling massacre starting from our Turner's Falls massacre all the way down through the 1890s and 1900s, and then it took a different form, right? Couldn't really go out and shoot Indians anymore because there were reporters around, literally. And so then it became a different kind of suppression. Let's detribalize everybody, no more real Indians. So that, bit by bit, I think I have a date where the Narragansetts and Pequots, after 100 years, after being supposedly detribalized by the state of Rhode Island, Massachusetts, they were able to, after 100 years of fighting and maintaining, they were able to get some kind of recognition. But is it a double-edged sword like David was talking about? So, again, each one of these lines has a story and has a list of victims that is atrocious. But I don't want to end on a down note, but I just wanted you to know that if you wish to look into this, I've got copies here, and you could certainly check that out. Let me see if David has something that he wants to say in closing, and then we'll go to comments, okay? All right.
So excuse me for the hands, we'll get right to it.
I just wanted to mention, I know we're going over here, so I'm going to be quick and then get to your questions. We will stay and answer all your questions, by the way. after we got past the massacres and the outright blatant murder of people, couldn't really do that in that way anymore, so they had to find a different way to do that, and they did it through making Native people citizens, unwillingly. And if you go, I found that, they called it the Enfranchisement Act, I believe it was 1869, where they declared that all the natives of Massachusetts were now citizens. And you can read that a couple different ways. They had hoped that people would read it in that, okay, well now all the Indians have the same rights as everybody else. And maybe some Native people did believe that that was the case, but unfortunately no, it was not. Now being citizens of the Commonwealth, they were subject to the laws and the jurisdiction of the courts and the policies of the state, which were very racial and very unfair. And that allowed them to come in and pass judgment on families, and a lot of times what would happen is they would come in and just pull the kids out of the homes for some claim of abuse or neglect or something, where if the parents were away working at the house during the day and the kids were home, they were considered to be lacking in their parenting skills, and the children were removed and put on these plantations and basically worked as slaves. So that was the continuation of the breakup of the families. And that probably had the biggest impact that we're dealing with now, more than any. A lot of the massacres have been forgotten by, 1869 in the 1900s, but our children were continuing to be removed from our families without just cause. A lot of times too, you'd have people living in these newly formed towns, and they wanted a piece of property that the natives were still occupying, so all they had to do was call the state and say, these Indians aren't taking care of the kids, come and remove them. And they could make up all kinds of stuff. It didn't have to be true, but that's what they did. And the further removal of the Native people from there, still holding on to small portions of land in the state, but that was the continuation of that. And the final blow was to the family unit. The sterilization of women through the almshouse system set up in 1852. You could be labeled as insane for a number of reasons, and many of you today, including myself at that time, would be labeled insane. Just for even coughing the wrong way. Seriously, look it up, what constituted what an insane person was back in that time, and just about anybody could be coined under that term, and they used it as they wanted to. So through these systems they were doing testing with immunizations back on that time with the minorities, Native Americans, African Americans, Irish Americans. They would always do the minorities, of course, because they didn't really matter to them. More like animals than human beings.
Who's the they? You keep saying they.
Who's the they?
Please, identify the they.
Well, I can't really give you a name, but you could look at it on a lot of different levels, but I'm talking about state policy by, at that time, the Massachusetts General Court and the leadership in Massachusetts. But you had other entities that were over and above them. Certain commercial entities that were behind it and benefiting in a commercial venture from these actions as well. Landowners, certain political figures that had certain stakes and certain plans for whatever they had for the land. You can't really nail down one answer for that, but it's policy making, it's certain political figures and certain commercial institutions and corporations that were behind that.
Well, I guess I'm just what, they were colored people. They were not colored people. Who's the they? Is that right? They were the European invaders who were
I
the they.
didn't specify a race. I don't think it has to do with race. That's just it.
Well, I think it does, because colored people were not making those laws. Indians were not making those laws. African heritage people were not making those laws.
Yeah. I don't agree that it was. I think it was focused on a certain race of people for a reason, but I don't think it mattered if they were purple, orange, black, white.
But they're not purple, orange, or black.
Yeah.
I mean, they were black, but they're not purple or orange.
Yeah.
There were specific groups of people who were making those laws, and they
Yeah.
weren't the colored people of the land who were making those laws.
That's right.
All right.
That's right. Right. But my thing is, I know this is hard for some people to hear and to understand what I'm really trying to say by this, and don't take offense and make it sound like racism doesn't exist, because it certainly does. And we all know that, and we know there's actions being taken against people because of their skin color. But the people manipulating your mind into that belief don't care. They really don't. They're manipulating your mind so you can fight against one person or the other for a certain aim that they have, usually commercially motivated, usually having to do with money or some type of ownership type ideal. It has nothing to do, they could care less what color you are. If you're in their way, they're going to take you out. And now, in this society, in this law system that we have, it doesn't really matter what color your skin is. It really doesn't. If you stand up and speak out against what they're trying to tell you, you are the enemy. I don't care if you're white, black, or anything. So we're all in this together is my point. That we need to be, stop allowing our minds to be manipulated by race, because it was a concept created by people that wanted to manipulate you in the first place. Do we have different groups and races and communities of people? Sure. What does their skin color really reflect? It reflects where they lived on the earth, where their ancestors lived on the earth. That's it. You're still a human being. You still have the same body parts I do. Your face and your body structure is basically the same. It has all the same geometric configurations, a little variations from here to there. But we're the same beings, is my point. And your physical features only have to do with your ancestors' location on the earth and the climate that they endured. That's it. We have dark skin because of the climate, and we were out in the sun. People from England and that part of the country at that time, there was very little sun exposure at that time because of the environment and the climate at that time. That's why your skin's white, because you weren't exposed to the sun as much. African people had a much higher exposure to the sun. So their skin adjusted to that. It has nothing to do with these special little classes of groups that people claim to be parts of, that white's a superior race, or black's a superior race, or whoever. That's all just a mind game for you to keep you occupied and to keep you away from the real issue. So agree or don't, but just at least think about it at least a little bit. Yes?
I have a question. Thanks, first of all, for sharing your information with us and your stories. But I'd like to, I guess I'm seeking information of, okay, Jeffrey Amherst and Turners, right? There's towns named after these people who were horrid, actually. How do you feel about that?
Well, I mean, the very creation of the town in the first place was probably, the first bad step, and then naming it after murder was probably the second. But these days I think arguing over names and what things are called, I don't really think it's that important. I think it's that we understand that happened.
Well,
you know what I mean?
Yeah, I understand. I do think it's very important, only for the fact that if the town is called Satan, then no one would want to live there, right? But it's okay if it's called Jeffrey Amherst and Turners, and it has bothered me since I've moved here and gotten to know, about the towns and what has happened. And it seems like why would one want to glorify that name, Jeffrey Amherst Bookstore, Jeffrey Amherst Hotel, whatever? Why should that be glorified on the basis of what they did? And if that, and you said that you want to make things better, well, that name is not helping alone.
I would agree with you totally there. I mean, you look at much of the holidays in this country that we celebrate, and they're all basically lies. I mean, and a misinterpretation of the truth. And you asked why they do it. Well, just for that reason, so you don't know the truth.
Why do we keep the name? I know in Germany, you don't see Hitler anywhere. A child can't even be called Hitler.
Right.
There's no town called Hitler.
Right.
Or Adolf.
Right.
So why do we still have these two names? It bothers me, I'm sorry.
Well, just anecdotally, I was born and raised in Turners Falls, and Now that I'm getting educated about this, first of all, the man shows up for 3 hours and kills 400 people, and they name a town for him, which is pretty bad. There are people in Montague who want to change the name. So there are deep feelings about that and wanting to change it. One of the issues, of course, are people who, just like all the others, calling on tradition. Well, we want to call the Washington Redskins. We want to keep Redskins. We want to keep our Seminole tomahawk chop. And, people get very stubborn about these things, but we're working on it. It would make all the sense in the world. At the very least, for example, the high school, the junior high is now called the Great Falls High School, which is junior high, which is middle school, which is very important. But believe me, there's a tug of war. Don't ever think you're going to change the name of Turner's Falls. And, a lot of us would like it to be called the Great Falls. So I agree. I think that it's definitely a battle that people are getting ready to fight. In terms of, Amherst, oh boy, that's so deeply rooted, and it is an atrocity. People raise that issue in the Hampshire Gazette and other papers with some regularity. He happened to be an Indian killer who is glorified in the textbooks, although he deeply suggested that somebody else deliver blankets with smallpox to tribal people during Pontiac's War. I can really, we can understand what you're saying, and I think that it would make sense to. One of the people that I didn't mention, but who's on my list, was a Southerner who's in Kentucky, who made his reputation as an Indian killer, scorched earth policy, killing everything, everyone who resisted, who were people of color, and he became U.S. Senator, then he became the governor, and there's a bronze statue to him still in Washington, D.C., and he got himself there because he killed people. So there are a lot of targets and things that really should be rectified, but I'm with you on and I'm sure David is on both those counts. Some of these names really, hopefully, especially maybe an outcome from this battlefield and the battlefield study and the atrocity that happens, maybe something will come out of that in terms of gaining some momentum to change that. I think, like I said, Great Falls has been put out there a couple of times. So, okay. You want to finish? And
Yeah, just one more thing. I was thinking, I would think it would help to list the curse if the names were changed.
Yeah, I think that's up to the communities. I mean, if your community is uncomfortable with that, then you need to gather together and tell your community leaders to change it. That's what
Sven
should
has
be
had his
done.
hand up, and then we'll go around.
I believe it was in 1992 when I was at a ceremony put together by the Nipponzan Mahuji monks at the Peace Pagoda at Unity Park, where we walked on Hiroshima Day across the bridge to the stone marker, which is where the refugee village is. And that was because it was 500 years of the arrival of Columbus to this world. The fact is that next year is, I think, the 340th anniversary of the massacre at the Great Falls on May 19th. And then in 2020, it's the 400th anniversary of Pilgrims arriving in Plymouth. And then in 2026 is the 350th anniversary of the massacre at Great Falls. The question is there a ceremony, every, like on the 19th of May, where people come to the site and people are called in, people are called in? Is there an effort to bring in you know, ancestors of the tribes, as well as maybe ancestors of whoever served under Captain Turner and Lieutenant Holyoke. Is there a list of people who served under Lieutenant Holyoke
check
and
that
Captain
out.
Turner in the Massachusetts archives?
It's going to be on the website, the list of names. We have a number of people who have researched that. It's pretty available as to what militia, colonial settler people were on that list. And a lot of their descendants are still in the area.
But is
We
there an effort to
do-
call in, kind of bring
Yeah.
in?
We do have a gathering at the Discovery Center near the dam on every May 19th, or the closest day we can get to that. So we have been doing that for a number of years. Interesting that you mentioned that monument, because the wording is very, very atrocious, fitting the crime, and people argue about whether it should be taken or changed or whatever, which I agree. But there's always some kind of graffiti on that, and I think both of those things are important to still have. I mean, that people are resisting and angry about it, and I think most of the residents in that area could care less whether it was there or not, of course, until we try to move it. But it is the target of a number of other signs protesting the wording and protesting what happened.
Could you tell us exactly where it is?
Beg your pardon?
Could you tell us exactly where it
Yeah,
is?
when you leave, what do I call it, Turner's Falls? When you leave the village and you cross the bridge going towards Gill,
Gill,
it's on your immediate
Oh,
right, right at
Riverview,
the foot of
or
the bridge.
Riverside Drive?
Yeah, there's
Raccoon River.
What, pardon?
There's also another one at Green River. The one at the Green River swimming pool is actually more atrocious than the one.
I hear you, yeah.
On Route 2.
And David, just real quick, the flag, isn't there an effort to change the emblem, the Massachusetts state flag? Doesn't
that-
Representative Rushing have an effort to change the sword over the
Yeah, it's
American
pretty
on
lame,
the state
yeah.
flag and on the station?
Come over and help
I mean,
us.
but is there an ongoing effort for that?
You know-
Okay, should I answer that?
Go ahead.
There's really no effort. I mean, I think there was talk about that. I mean, I'm not really one for flags in the first place, so I think there's a lot more important energy to be put into, but I think it's good to understand what you're seeing there. And there's more to it than what you think. That symbol of the dagger above the state emblem with the native on it, supposedly King Philip, or the state says that it's not King Philip, it's somebody from Ohio or whatever, which is ridiculous. That dagger there, I found out was the earliest organization of Indian killers called the Three County Troop, which was a state-sponsored organization of elite soldiers that they dispersed throughout the state to clean the state of vagrants and especially Indians. Now they're known as the state police troopers. Okay? So that's what they're telling you there. They're through that elite force of people with that dagger in their hand, which represents the Three County Troop or their military force, which is now the state police. Don't go against us because you'll end up like, I mean, it's telling you a story there without telling you too much. I mean, to me, I think it's a good talking point, but I think it's more than just a racial, I don't know if it was intended to be a racial outcry or anything, or just to scare Indians, but I think that was basically a statement of who they were. And I think a lot of the flags, if you look into symbolism, they're telling you a lot without you even knowing it. Look at the United States flag. Very, very close in resemblance to the East India Trading Company, which is a slave trading company that operated internationally, even to the present day. So, even though flags are what they are, a lot of them tell you the story as far as where they come from and who's running them. So, any other questions?
We'll go around this way. So Joe was commenting on the flag.
I just want to get people to think about How Change Occurs. It's a wonderful book by an author named Gladwell. He wrote a book called The Tipping Point.
Malcolm Gladwell.
We can't hear you, Joe. And Malcolm Gladwell sets some of the mechanics in motion of how change happens and what kind of magic it takes to make change happen. We're talking about changing the name of Amherst and Turner Falls and maybe the state symbol and a lot of these things. And it is not out of the realm of possibility that we can, that some of us can make that happen at some point in time. So the next question is, what's it take to make that happen? And I suggest reading Malcolm Gladwell's book. But the other part about it, let's talk about what's happening right here, right now. That's part of that conversation, it's part of that change. Let's talk about the 2004 reconciliation ceremony. That's part of that change. Let's talk about people starting to gather on May 19th and starting to try to find healing from both cultural sides of the issue. That's part of that change. Let's talk about the internet. Let's talk about education. Let's talk about the intelligence of our children. Let's talk about the possibilities, because that tipping point that Malcolm Gladwell speaks of is approaching. And the world is shrinking, and I believe that the kind of change that we'd like to see happen with the changing of names and towns and such, very much might find that tipping point somewhere in our lifespan. But if not, we can certainly plant the seeds to create the energy and the attitude to help those changes occur. And I think gathering here today is part of that. And I wanted to point that out.
Thank you, Joe. That's beautiful. Yeah, and I think another thing to remember too is, I mean, changing names is great for an intent, but if we don't change the way we think or treat each other, we're just going to be continuing the same thing. It doesn't matter what it says. That's my kind of point. Not that it's not important, and that we don't, address those issues. But if we don't change the way we operate and the way we treat people and each other, then we're just going to be headed down the same path anyway. So yes, that's a good thing to do, but if you don't start here, everybody wants to change everything out there, right? We don't want to look here. Huh? Start here, not out there, and then that will help the world change much, much quicker, believe me. Go ahead.
My thoughts.
Pam, can you hold off, because these people have been queued up, so we'll get to you shortly. Yeah.
I was just curious, you mentioned the name Holyoke, and I'm from Holyoke, and I hadn't heard that history. Is there a place I can look into that more? I'm assuming it's the same Holyoke.
Google, man, I'm telling you. It's great. Yeah, they have a lot of old historical books online, some of the old town archives and histories and things, a lot of stuff in the Smithsonian archives they put online now. A lot of good stuff out there. So yeah.
Connected to the massacre that he was
There's
a part
also
of.
the Holyoke Public Library.
Holyoke Public Library, yes. Yes,
Okay.
thank you.
But there is, you would find it in a lot of the accounting of that battle. There's a 100-year-old history book called George Sheldon's History of Deerfield, where he does a lot of detailed information about the survivors and the attackers. Not so much about the Indians, but it's pretty good. It's pretty good. So that's Sheldon's history. It's probably online too. If you had a question, or is it yes?
I have a question about the project and moving forward. And you had gathered perhaps 7 or 8 tribal families to satisfy the artificial boundaries of Massachusetts law. In finding those families, have you also found families speaking their original tongue? And how extensive has your search gone in gathering the oral histories? Are you able to get it from those families and any in the original tongue?
I'm not sure what you mean by families, but there are 3 tribes, or 4 tribes involved in the project right now. So a tribe, I guess, is just a collection of families, so I suppose that's accurate. But as I said before, there are no, as far as relating to the battle, there's no existing histories or stories about details of that day that exist that I know of. I mean, they may exist, I'm not saying they don't exist, and then I know the Narragansetts claim to have some kind of oral history, and I'm looking forward to reading that, but I highly doubt that there's really any detailed accounts from a native's point of view existing. There may be in some closet, in some archive, in some town stuffed away, we may have a native were natives around in that time that could read and write. And it would make sense that they would have documented some of this stuff. Or it could exist up in Quebec, because a lot of people went north and west. New York records could hold a lot of this stuff, and a lot, of course, in England as well. A lot of these records and treaties that natives had with, not Massachusetts, but with the Crown of England. Remember, the United States didn't exist till 1776. So, which was long after, 100 years after the King-Philip War. So, these treaties and agreements that natives had relative to land were with the Crown of England, not with Massachusetts Bay Colony. Massachusetts Bay Colony was just a charter of the Crown. They really had no legal authority over any native people because we were a separate nation. The king had the relationship with the native people. A lot of those treaties and records of that were intentionally burnt in some of the library fires that happened in England in the 1800s. So a lot of that evidence doesn't exist. But interesting enough, just to leave you with, I told you about the treaties being with the Crown. Well, when the Crown terminated the charter for the Massachusetts Bay Colony, they were basically left, they had no authority at all. They didn't have anything, they were just in the middle of water. And the Crown, based on the complaints from native tribes going back to the Crown, because natives were traveling back and forth to England too, don't forget. The king was being informed to his constables that the people of the Massachusetts Bay were illegally usurping land by the hundreds and hundreds of acres. And when this got back to the king, he sent his constables to investigate. They reported back to him in 1774 and said, yes, this is happening. The king sent a letter to the colonies saying, you will immediately vacate all the lands. Now, we're told that this great country was born from breaking free from British taxation, right? I tend to think it's because they were told to get off the land they had stolen. They didn't like that very much, I'm sure.
Who's the
So, excuse me?
I just said, who's the they?
Who's the they?
Yeah.
Everybody who was benefiting, everybody who was on the land, anybody. It's not anybody specific, it's anybody that was a landholder, anybody that had a business and was profiting from the land that they were illegally occupied.
Who's that?
Right.
Washington and his crew, he was one of them.
Yeah, I know. I think it's a rhetorical question because using the word they is passive voice. And there were particular people from particular ethnic groups who were instigating and propagating these injustices.
I agree.
And to hide them under the term they is an injustice to people who are sitting in this room. And anybody that you're speaking to. And you can put me down for having to identify so-called ethnic groups or racial groups, but the fact is that there were particular racial ethnic groups who were perpetrating these misdeeds and injustices.
Thank you.
And to hide them behind they does not serve us at all.
Thank you, that's a good point to make, and definitely not putting you down at all or anything you think so.
Can I
Peace.
show this to you? Shen is telling us we've overextended our time, but to Kathleen's point, Scots, Ulster, Irish. This person, this came out last year, it's called An Indigenous Peoples History of the United States. I'd really recommend it. It is by a woman named Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz. But she identifies the they. She says these were Ulster, Scots, Irish, and Protestant Calvinists, and she lists the names of 17, 18, 19 of the presidents who descended, including Ronald Reagan, Bill Bushes, Bill Clinton, etc. So that puts a name on it. And these were the Davy Crockett's, Kit Carson's, Daniel Boone's. These were the people who came over, who cut their teeth on suppressing the Irish, and then moved over here. So but I recommend this for people who would be wanting to follow up on this. Quite interesting. Shen really wants us to leave. We'll stay and questions. I'll put it on her. But thank you for coming. And